Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our February Trauma-Informed Workshop. This month, our topic is on understanding the impact of domestic violence on children. As you can see, we have three very special, very wonderful speakers with us today. First, we have Elaine Whitefeather. Many of you have seen Elaine here before. She was here in October. She's also done some videos with us on our YouTube account, so you can see her speaking there as well. Elaine is the Executive Director for Community for Peace. She's been in the domestic violence field, family violence field for a long time. And it's exciting. I just also want to announce that Elaine was recently named, I think this week or last week, Woman of the Year by Assemblyman Cooley. So that's pretty, yeah, that's pretty great. And next to Elaine, we have Dave Cropp. Dave Cropp is one of those interesting guys who actually studied social work and then became a cop. So it's a wonderful combination for any of you who have worked with law enforcement to work with a law enforcement officer who understands social work and what it's like to be a victim. So he started off in social work, ended up with the SAC PD, was a sergeant over the family violence unit for a long time as well. And Dave also co-founded the Domestic Violence Prevention Collaborative in Sacramento County, which is where I met him many years ago. And then next to Dave, we have Robin Basinger, and she is the Director of Programs and Operations at a Community for Peace. She co-created the program with Elaine and has been in the field of domestic violence for 29 years. So a huge wealth of knowledge here today. They've recently launched this training program for CPS workers, and they've tailored it specifically for victims' compensation to help you guys understand what it's like navigating the system as a survivor of domestic violence and as a child who's grown up in this environment. Okay, so Elaine.
Thank you very much for having us back here. A long time would be like 36 years. That's a really long time. And the nice thing about being in this field is, as a survivor, is you got a good memory. Survivors have very, very good memories about certain things, and not so good memories about other things that you need us to have memories about, right? So I'm grateful to be here today. I want to kind of tell you a little bit about how we came to form this particular training. Dave and Robin and myself are a training team, and what we present often is the Children Exposed to Domestic Violence. This is a grant, one of 3 in the state of California, that that encourages systems to work together. So it actually was a law enforcement grant that asked to partner with a domestic violence agency that then we brought in CPS to add to our DVERT first response team. So in Citrus Heights, in this northern part of the county, we are working together with both Child Protective Services, law enforcement, and all of our DV advocates and CBOs around us to provide some trauma-informed understanding about how to intervene on domestic violence, but more importantly, what's that impact on that next generation. For you all know, we are dealing with the 3rd and 4th generation of family violence, and so that means that what I experienced as a child is probably pretty normal for most kids living in a 2nd or 3rd generation of domestic violence. So that means that by the time they need to have some assistance and help, their issues and their trauma and their impact is far more. So it becomes necessary for us. I think in my field, as long as I've been in the field, there's a lot we can do to help victims and adult victims, but I know that we're never going to end this issue unless we intervene on the children. And so what we do know from research is that the child's brain is changed, and what you need to understand is it doesn't change back. Once it's changed, it's changed. And so a child, like any adult, has to learn to deal with this and live with this in very sort of unique ways. And so we kind of want to give you the environment of it. So I was here. How many of you were here in October and got that big training there? So here's what we want to do. I just want to take a little bit of that training and bring it forward. So I'm going to review a little bit, because I think we need to understand the context with which these kids are living, okay? We don't focus on that environment enough, and I'd like for us to do that. So when we think about domestic violence, the most important thing I want you to understand right now is that it's a learned behavior. Domestic violence is a learned behavior. Domestic violence is not marital difficulty. Domestic violence is not anger management. Domestic violence isn't learned helplessness. Domestic violence isn't a need for assertiveness training. Domestic violence is something very deliberate and intentional. And so I want us to understand where that comes from. I want us to understand that historically in the United States of America, domestic violence was not against the law until 1981. So that makes a big difference, doesn't it? For folks who have experienced stuff before 1981, that's just how you live. Why? Because we actually had a law in the United States that gave men permission to beat their wives and their children as long as they used a weapon no bigger than their thumb. Now, what we are dealing with is the sociological impact of that law. And once we changed the law in 81, now we have to change all the minds and the hearts and the values in our culture and our society about how women and children should be treated, how families are going to be healthy. So I need to give you that backdrop because that's a really big deal. You know, it's not any different than us understanding that it was not against the law to have slavery in our country either. But look at the impact we're still dealing with, that historical trauma. So when we make a law or we create in a culture a value system, a way of life, belief systems about the value of women and the value of children, when you have that, it makes it pretty easy to objectify and minimize abuse and trauma. Not only is it making it easy from the male privilege side of things, but it makes it very easy for victims and children to also normalize and minimize and feel like they don't have the right to complain about what's happening to them, or to feel like there's nothing that can be done. There will be no system that will respond. There will be no child protective services or law enforcement or anyone in our society whom we need to call upon for help. We have a deep core belief that no one will help us, so why bother telling you all of the truth? So to be trauma-informed, let me just remind us, means that we understand the impact of trauma. There's a lifespan of trauma. It doesn't just happen in the one incident. It kind of lasts and lingers in the dream. And then we understand the impact of that trauma on the life of the person who had it. So at 62 years old, I still have impact from things that I lived through at 2 and 3, 4, 7 years old. Right? Because my brain was changed and it didn't change back. Okay? But I learned to compensate in lots of different ways. So many of us end up being, you know, kind of brilliant in some areas and not so much in other areas. And we learn to adapt to it in much in the same way that you have some kind of a disability you learn to live with. So it hasn't ever stopped me from climbing every mountain I wanted to climb. But I have to understand the kind of help I need to get to the top of every mountain I wish to go. Does that make sense to you? So we are also the three kind of people that like you to ask questions. So we'll have a space at the end if there's more. But if there's something you don't understand, the thing I learned is sort of like this. You know how when you were in school and you got that one thing you didn't get and you can't learn the rest of it because nobody answered that one question? Right. So if that comes to you, you raise your hand because I want you to get the rest of it. And if there's something we said that doesn't make any sense, we need to answer that so we can get to the next place. Does that make sense to you? Alrighty. So I'm going to turn this over to Robin so that she can give you just that little quick review and a backdrop on this environment. What you have to understand when you're dealing with children is you really need to understand the environment they are living in and what they are seeing. And what they are experiencing is not always the same as what the adults are experiencing and what their world is about. Does that make sense to you? So I'm going to turn over to Robin and let her take you through that brief overview.
Good day. I'm happy to be here. So my job is to set up Dave, because he's really going to go to town with children exposed to DV. But as Elaine said, it is important, even if you've heard it again. I've been training domestic violence for 29 years, and so sometimes I get those old advocates or those old marriage family therapists, and they go, yeah, I've heard it. But you know what? We're constantly growing and changing, and so when we grow and change, to hear something again, it's sort of like, wow, that gives us another piece, a piece that was missing, or enlightenment. So what we're going to do is we are going to do a quick review of establishing the environment of domestic violence. First thing that I would say is that in the domestic violence movement, whether it's California or across the nation, we all train from common denominators, but we do not all train the same. And it'd be my prayer and my hope and my wish in the future that we have a uniformity in training, because this is a very camouflaged social epidemic. Most people in our culture think that domestic violence is about hitting. And so we get a lot of feedback from victims and people in our culture that says, don't worry, this is not domestic violence, there was no hitting. Well, what we're going to review is the truths about domestic violence, and we're going to break through some myths here to set that foundation. So here we go. I'm going to read a few of these and highlight them. This is our common social myths on the causes and solutions of domestic violence. So a lot of people think it's just about that abuser losing control, or that they just need anger management and that will fix the issue. Or if he wouldn't drink, there would be a problem. So we give a lot of authority over to drinking as a cause. It is not a cause at all. It's a trigger, but it is not a cause. Or he just needs a job. So frankly, sometimes we will hear that, again, from victims, from abusers, from law enforcement, from attorneys. He just needs a job, and if we can get this guy to get a job, we won't have domestic violence. Nothing could be further from the truth. If she would just leave, it would solve everything. No, that's a huge myth. No, because the victim mentality and the victim psychology stays with you even if that abuser leaves or you leave that abuser. So it's about breaking down these internalized myths that you've learned through the path of domestic violence. If they could get into marriage counseling, sometimes this is actually something that is very dangerous to encourage or suggest or prescribe to a couple, because this issue is not about we have communication problems, as we'll see, because again, we're still just going through myths here. She's just dramatic. Well, that, yes, but it's not a cause. There's a lot of drama in DV, but it's not, her being dramatic is not the cause of violence. It doesn't really impact the kids. That's going to be our focus here today. Yes, it does. Let me quickly sidebar and tell you about a program that we have at a Community for Peace that is a one-of-a-kind in the nation, and it's called DVRT. It's an acronym, DVRT, and it stands for Domestic Violence Response Team. And what this is that we put highly trained family violence specialists in the front seat of a patrol car. And we pair them with a police officer and we say, go respond to family violence, domestic violence, and sexual assault. So no one else has been doing this. So these counselors will go on a 12-hour patrol, and they will go with their partner into the scene of domestic violence. I'm pausing here because the number one thing when I developed, actually Elaine came up with the idea and then I developed it. The number one thing that I heard over and over while I was creating the program and while it was in its pilot stages was, don't worry, it doesn't impact the kids. They were in the back room sleeping. They don't notice. See, they're over there playing their games. And so we don't really have a problem because we don't see any impact to our kids. And this is a true epidemic out here. So this is why we really have to review and get through breaking these myths. If she would try harder. Hear that a lot too. Try harder at what? Everything, cooking, cleaning, in the bedroom, etc. Not a cause, not a solution, that is for sure. Trying harder is not a solution. She's never been hit, so it's not TV. It's a private issue. I know we'd all like to keep it a private issue, but it isn't a private issue because even if you think it's contained in the home, everybody's got to go out and get groceries, right? And so there are violent episodes at church. There are violent episodes at the supermarket, on the freeway, at schools, everywhere. It is not contained inside the home. Maybe if they talk to their minister, talking to your minister isn't always a good thing, but as you'll see in a minute, ministers do not always understand domestic violence, so it's hard for them to respond appropriately. Middle and upper class women do not get battered as frequently as lower class. That is a big myth. They just do not call shelters as often. So we get confusing stats, so we think, oh, they're not impacted at all, when truly this is a all fair in every spectrum of our society. Batterers are violent in all of their relationships. No, batterers have great control. They know when to do it and how to do it, and that's what we'll talk about. And that's what we all need to remember when we're addressing this issue. And finally, once a battered woman, always a battered woman is not true. Because if that were true, then a quarter of society wouldn't be functioning. Yes, if you've been battered, you can heal and you can move on. Here's what domestic violence is. Domestic violence is a pattern of assaultive and coercive behaviors, including physical, psychological, and sexual attacks that adults or adolescents use against their intimate partners. What's important for all of us is that this is a behavioral definition, and of course law enforcement is working off of a whole different definition. They have to, because they have very specific rules and regulations on whether they can arrest or not arrest. That's really Dave's area. He might talk about a little bit later. Here's the things we're emphasizing as we're setting up for children exposed. Domestic violence is a repetitive pattern. It is not an incident. An incident is a one-time thing. When you have incident after incident after incident after incident, this creates a pattern. The pattern creates an environment, and that's what we all need to understand. It's not just this thing that's happening between two people. It's changing that home environment that these kids are walking into and living in. And again, this happens to every sector of society, covers every race, socioeconomic class, and sexual orientation. That being said, I will still say that the dominant is still female victim, probably 90% out here in our culture. So here we go. Domestic violence is about someone having power and control over you. This is where we have to get real about abusers and abusers' tactic. If I'm an abuser, I want one thing from you, and one thing only. I want your mind. I want to be able to have control over your mind. If I have control over your mind, in the way of your beliefs and your attitudes and your likes and your dislikes and your thoughts and your actions and your emotions, I've got control over everything. So this is what we need to understand, is that as an abuser, I'm going to be in charge of your life. Your liberties are going to leave you. And the cherry on the cake for abusers is this. I'm going to have control over your mind, but I'm going to make you think that things are your idea. That's how I'm going to manipulate. That's how I'm going to coerce. If I can get you to think it's your idea, or if I can get you to think that you are mentally ill, 5150, then controlling you is even easier. This is one person wanting to have power and control over another. Every aspect of your life. We have victims. I will try to be very conservative here. But we have victims who are not allowed to go to the bathroom until they are told to go to the bathroom. We have victims who are not allowed to leave the house until they are given permission to leave the house. The common things I think that everybody hears about with domestic violence is they cannot talk to their families, they cannot talk with their friends, they cannot socialize unless they get permission. Because again, I don't want anyone else influencing you. I want to be your primary influence. So it comes down to those home liberties as well. You do not get to get on the internet or watch TV, and if you do get on the internet, I'm watching what you're watching. Today in our culture, technology is out of the box, and so victims are being stalked and followed more today like never before. My phone is turned off, but I could still be tracked and followed with my phone turned off with the right program. So we have women who are in a lot greater danger than ever before. So one thing that we want everybody to note here is that this is part of our social problem, is that domestic violence is largely misidentified and misunderstood by the people who should know this issue the best. So including doctors and nurses and attorneys and principals and teachers and even victims. When I go into a scene from DVERT and I walk in, I will say to the person after I am introduced, you know, I will do a quick assessment, I will introduce myself, and they think this is a wonderful program that you guys are coming out and that you're coming to DV scenes and everything, but many times the victim says, but why are you here? Most victims do not self-identify. Most victims will not call themselves a victim of domestic violence for all of those reasons that we put up on the screen earlier, for all of those myths. And think about it. It's understandable. Who wants to call themselves a victim? Some over-identify with being a victim. Some see it as even a right to call themselves as a victim. But most at the onset do not self-identify as a victim. So the issue of DV, we're addressing this issue superficially. We're doing it from myths, and we're believing that this is one-dimensional. And so we're not understanding our victim responses, we're not understanding abuser tactics, and we're really not understanding the impact to children. So the kids can be in the back room, they can be sleeping through everything, but it still impacts their brain development. So we have to get out of this myth. We have to get out of the myths of the causes. We have to get out of the myths of the solutions. Otherwise, we, as helpers out here, are helping to perpetuate this very big chronic problem that we have. You want me to do this line? This is what I'd want everyone to understand, is that I know that you all have had some basic DV stuff, but this would be my focus and my emphasis right here, and that is this, that all abuse impacts the victim's psychology and emotions. That's what you have to understand. More of domestic violence is psychological than anything else. Because again, if I can make you sad, and I can make you upset, and I can make you spin, and I can make you fearful, then I have control over you. And that's ultimately everything that I want. All right. Elaine has asked me to pause here because this is something that we spent a lot of time with CPS understanding, and that is this. Verbal violence, when we think about verbal violence, I will not get dramatic today. I usually get really dramatic, but I think I need to be conservative today, is usually when we hear yelling. So a lot of the DV calls that we go to in Citrus Heights, the RP, the reporting party, is a neighbor. So that's how we know there's domestic violence. The neighbor calls, hey, this couple's been fighting, it's been constant, so please get out here, and we go. But what we all need to understand, again, in terms of addressing the issue, is that verbal violence, this right here is just really about using the voice. And as an abuser, I do not have to yell because my threats are going to speak volumes for me. So I can use a voice just like this, and I can use a voice just like this. So if I have yelled, then you don't want me to yell because that scares you and it's escalation. I might hit you after that. But as an abuser, I like to have control just at this range. I like to just be able to use my voice, or I like to even lower it so that society perceives me as a gentleman, especially when I'm going to CPS. Okay? So what we really need to understand here is this. If I am an abuser again, and I am telling you to shut the F up, and I am escalating, well, maybe tomorrow we might have a CPS meeting. So I don't like you talking, so I'm telling you to shut the F up, and you're not doing it. So it's going to escalate, and I'm going to try to strangle you. And as I try to strangle you and I put my hand around your neck, I'm going to change the range in my voice, and I'm going to say, shut Now, tomorrow, when we go to CPS and that CPS worker meets us, then I use that same voice. Oh, honey, come here, sit here. Now that voice has triggered her into that association, that recollection of last night when I just strangled you. And that's all I need to do. And so CPS perceives me then as a gentleman. A very good guy, very solid, very interested in what I'm saying, and it is all part of my strategy. This is what we need to understand, is that abusers have strategy. Abusers abuse consciously. They know what they're doing. And so we can't be thinking that the use of the voice is just about yelling. No. And if we just, again, if we compartmentalize that violence is just yelling and hitting, we're missing 3/4 of domestic violence. Let me stop here.
So what I want to add to this piece of the verbal violence, and as we're talking about these forms of abuses, if I'm a child, I'm hearing all of this. And I'm going to become more hypersensitive than even the adults are, because the smaller I am, when I was a young kid, my job as the oldest child, right, is to protect the rest of the siblings. That's my job. I can see clearly my mom can't do it. Okay? So my job, I'm parentified at 3, 4, 5 years old. So I'm already protecting and taking care of 4 other siblings is what I'm doing. All right? So I learn how to hear. I learn how to hear what's being said. I learn how to hear what's not being said. I am so sensitive to a tone, an eyebrow lifting, a blinking of an eye. I learn how to read everything that is nonverbal. I know when to say yes and when not to say yes. I learn all of that because I have to. Not because I want to. I have to. It's my survival, and it's the survival of my siblings. I have to learn everything. And not only that, I have to learn how to read my mother. I have to learn how to figure out, is now the time to do something? Is this not the time to do something? Do we just pretend like it's all okay or not? So I have to learn all of this before I get to first grade. Right? Now I wonder how many of you as adults learn that. How to read people and their eyes, their blinks, their energy, what's said and what's not said. Most of us learn that in our careers and in training, and some of us, but when you are a child in domestic violence, you learn it before you learn how to read. Before you can read your first word, you can read life, and you read danger. So I really want us to understand that, because kids are far more sensitive to these things than adults will be.
This is very important here, so I am going to pause here. One of the tactics, the primary tactics, again, of an abuser is the psychological abuse. This is really 3/4 of the show right here. So one thing that abusers will do is that they will set it up so that that victim starts to question herself. And they'll do it in lots of different ways. So I have maybe 100,000 DV stories in my mind. So let me give you some common denominators. Boyfriend does not have a key to the apartment, so he breaks into the apartment, he goes into the refrigerator, and he just moves a couple of things. And he does that for a few days in a row. When he comes over, he might move something on the coffee table just to get her mind questioning. A husband and a wife are work in 2 different areas of the county. So he sneaks home at lunch and does the same thing. He will move things around. He will take her medication that she's taken for blood pressure, and he will put it somewhere really bizarre. And then she will ask him about it, and he'll go, I don't know what you're talking about. Well, I think you're working too hard, or maybe you better go see your doctor. And he starts planting seeds so that she will further question herself. On one of my first patrol shifts, and after doing this work for 29 years, I thought some things we might just cycle out of. And so on one of my first calls, we roll up to a scene and we get out, and here comes that abuser. And I'm with a male partner at this time, and he comes right over and he shakes my male partner's hand and says, hey, how you doing? Thanks for coming. I really appreciate it. Hey, man, can you do something? Because that chick's on the rag, man. She's cycling. It's her period. It's all messed up. It's effed up, man. No offense, ma'am, but, you know, it's really messed up. Or, hey, can you help me? Because she's real crazy. She can't find out where she put her meds. So can you take her to the ER for a mental evaluation? Because I think she's going crazy. And so the setup actually helps that victim think that she is going crazy. And this is a constant through their life. You know, we all know the DV where it's loud and it's obnoxious, where one abuser is just sort of poking at you the whole time. Like, if I came up to you and I just did this the whole time, sooner or later, you're going to get really pissed off at me. And you're going to say, please stop. and I'm not going to stop. And then I'll switch. Then maybe I'll just do it this way. And you'll go, please stop. And I'm not going to stop. And then I'm going to talk about, why are you wearing that? You know, your hair looks stupid like that. You know, you should get it colored. You know, other women look way better than you. Why don't you get a lift right here? Come on, make them bigger. And I'm just poking at you, poking at you, poking at you, poking at you, poking at you. And I'm doing it to get a reaction. I'm doing it to get you out of balance. I'm doing it so that you will yell back. I'm doing it so you will hit back. I'm doing it so you will question yourself. Now, here's the next thing I'm going to do. I'm going to bring the kids into the equation. Bobby, go tell Mommy she's cranky because she's on the rag. Mommy, you're cranky because you're on the rag. And then goes and runs away. Yes, the kids are prompted. Yes, the kids are coached by the abusers. And if I am an abuser and I do it and I laugh, ha ha ha, and then the kid laughs too, then the kid thinks, well, this is very innocent. And then Mom tries to brush it off. Huh? Now, Bobby, don't say that, don't do that. But it starts wrecking on her brain. Now even little Bobby's starting to say that. I wish he wouldn't do that. And these are all very, 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 very common tactics. And this is, again, what we need to understand about this issue. This issue is not just about this. 3/4 of it is this. Because if I have your brain, your mind, I have everything else that I need.
As a child, when you're drawn into the psychological abuse, you will end up, or I will say I ended up, thinking about my mother as though something was wrong with her. And that's what happens to get you caught between the two things. You can see that what your dad's doing is not correct. But when I look at my mom not doing anything and acting like she's crazy, after a while, I don't know, is she crazy or not crazy? Is he right or not right? So I don't know what thing is what. I just know the biggest person, the one with the most power, is saying this and everybody's acting as if. So after a while, I don't look at my mother as any potential protector. I don't look at my mother as anyone who actually can negotiate any kind of a system on my behalf. So after a while, I start learning that there's nobody there for me either, and I got to figure it out myself, right? And I don't know, I mean, you know, let me just take a sidebar here for a moment, because everybody take a breath, because you're not even breathing. Okay, here we go. Because this is an epidemic, and I know we're touching people here. I know that I'm not the only one with the story in here. Me and Dave and Robin are not the only survivors in this room. Domestic violence is an epidemic in our country. It's 1 in 3. So just here we all are, okay? This is the sisterhood and the brotherhood of folks who survived. And I want you to understand that. So if it's touching your little heart right now, pushing a little button right here, if you can just breathe through it, you'll get some healing, because finally somebody knows about this. Somebody knows about this, okay? And you're not crazy. It's just an impact. It's just an impact. I just want a sidebar to say that, because I can just sort of feel this in here, right? I do it everywhere I go. So I just want us to understand this, because my psychology as a child in this violent place is, by the time I'm 5 and 6 years old, where is my allies? Who do I look for who can help me? So by the time I'm in elementary school, I already have this very core belief: the world is against me. I don't got a mom that's for me, and I don't got a dad that's for me. Does it make sense? So I want you to kind of start to feel the isolation that the child starts to live in, even while they have to stay connected and almost enmeshed in the adult violence. But as an individual, you start to move away from that world, even though you must stay engaged in it. It's just a weird place to be.
So again, if we bring it back to kids, if I am an abuser, I can create such psychological terror that that victim presents as unresponsive, unstable, reactive, and controlling. And that's my perfect excuse to call CPS. CPS is one of the tools that an abuser will use. You're too messed up to be a parent. Well, how did you get messed up? It's through all of that psychological abuse. So this is used all the time. And so when we come on scene sometimes, law enforcement has a hard time responding to domestic violence. That's a whole other 2-hour thing. But you can imagine, they have a very hard time. One of the reasons that they have a hard time is because when we roll up there, that victim is a wreck. And law enforcement is trying to be methodical and ask questions and do a little critical thinking and analysis here. But if you are a victim, your thoughts are scattered, as if we have 50 Post-it notes and we just throw them everywhere. Your thinking is not sequential. Your remembering is not sequential. And so then when I come back as law enforcement officer and I go, well, then you just said, and then that victim goes, oh, I don't know, because they truly don't know. Because this is the goal, is to make you useless, essentially. And this has great impact on these victims as mothers. Then I cannot go and make oatmeal for my kid. I cannot change my baby's diaper. I cannot soothe them with a bedtime story because I think I'm going crazy.
And so oftentimes CPS or us will look at, why does that mother so easily give up her children? Why? This is how we're looking at it. We're seeing it, and I go, she doesn't want to be with these kids. She's just giving them up. I can tell you in my own circumstance, the self-doubt that gets created out of psychological abuse and crazy making things really made me feel like just being a mother was a failure. Just every time you just look at the kid, I'm already failing. I haven't done anything. So my self-doubt and my lack of confidence in any decision I would ever make was so prevalent that I just felt like if she really wanted to be with him, he would just be the better parent. By the time I separated with him, she was 11 years old, and I truly believed it. And she was just old enough to make her own choice. But really, truly, I was not going to fight for her because I truly believed I did not have the capacity to parent her.
So, of course, now this is the part that you're most familiar with, physical abuse. And just real quickly, it's everything from spitting to strangulation. I'm just going to call out strangulation, is that more victims now will report strangulation, not necessarily when law enforcement comes, but in our DV providers here in Sac County. I can say for us at ACFP, probably about 88% of our walk-ins, of our folks who come in for services, have been strangled at least once. And this is a very scary thing because even for a person who's been strangled can die up to 48 hours afterwards. You know, there can be swelling in the throat, little pieces of cartilage can break off. So when somebody calls for shelter and they say, hey, do you have a bed? We say, yes, what's going on? They say, hey, I was strangled and I really need to go somewhere. Well, we're there for you and we're going to give you a bed. But first, you need to get to the hospital. You really have to get to the hospital because this is a very serious thing. So I won't spend a lot of time on it. I just want everyone to understand that strangulation is escalating out there. And here's some good news, but it's also kind of unnerving. It wasn't until January 1st, 2012 that strangulation was turned into a felony. So when that happened, it was like, oh, yay, thank goodness. Maybe we will get more arrests. Maybe we will get more filings. Maybe there will be more prosecutions. I haven't seen any numbers on that one as of yet. But here's what I'd want you to understand again in the big overview, and we're going real fast here in the overview of domestic violence. After strangulation, there is no more escalation except for homicide. So when you have a victim who has been strangled, first of all, that's the highest lethality. And second of all, there's nowhere else for that abuser to take it except for homicide. And of course, that's happening a lot more out here. The increase in the numbers of domestic violence homicide is just, it's hard to keep track of. You'll hear it in the news as murder-suicide. We're seeing it all across the country. I think you can find one in the news just about every day, at least a few a week now, unfortunately, if you pay attention to the news. Okay, one thing that we do want to press pause on here as well is that, and this will make sense to you too in terms of, again, becoming a parent. What I'd want everyone to understand is, and this was really big for CPS to understand, is that this has been going on since the beginning of time, but forced impregnation is a commonly used but overlooked tactic by abusers. Why is she having so many kids, and especially with different partners? Well, to be very frank and bottom line, but yet staying conservative, she does not have a choice. And that's called rape. But again, before I get there as an abuser, I've got her to think that it's her idea, or that she plays along with it, or doesn't say no, or I get into some sort of psychology with her. These are the lighter things. I might make her watch pornography, or even force her to do it, or force her to take drug, or coerce her. But again, it's in that psychology. So we did our own study at ACFP, and about, let's see, 80% check off the box that there was no sexual abuse, because they didn't think or see it as abuse, because that abuser has changed her psychology and her perspective about it. So she thinks that this is her duty and that it's normalized. This is how I get love. So 80% of the time they say, no, there's no sexual abuse. But 90% of those admit to sexual violence once they're engaged in DV counseling. Once they're engaged in DV counseling and they have that trust with that counselor, and they're extracting and extrapolating their environment and the incidents, yes, it comes out. I was raped. I was sexually forced. And now my children are the product of that.
And so what we also want to remember is that spousal rape or marital rape was not against the law till 1993. So domestic violence is a crime in 81. Sexual violence or sexual assault in marriage, 1993, and strangulation in 2012. Do you see, this is a very modern movement we're in. I want us to really get that, because the issue's old, but the movement is new in terms of what we're addressing and how we're identifying it. So kudos to you to want to be learning this, because it's new every single year. There's more and more and more we begin to understand. Now, on a sidebar, just having said that part, let me just say this in my own personal experience. I just like to use my story because, you know, there it is. I moved through it so I can talk about it, right? My daughter is now 37 years old. She's a product of forced impregnation. She's a product of rape. When she was born, she looked identical to her father, the rapist. It was a little difficult for me to bond. It was a little difficult. I already had attachment disorders from growing up. So my big idea of human beings is, oh my God, I am one, and I have to hang out with other ones. You see? No, how do I do that? And then to have a child that is the replica of the man who raped you. It was difficult for me at that time, at 23 years old, 24 years old, to be able to open up my heart to go there. And I still had to live in this abusive marriage for 16 more years. So I'm wanting us to understand that insider understanding when moms or victims are talking to you and there is no affect about that child, and they don't seem to be emoting anything, or it appears as though they don't care. Let me just tell you, you got to lock your heart in the vault, and you don't let it out until you're safe. And talking to folks like you or CPS or law enforcement and even DV advocates is not called safe. Our job is to create a safe environment so people can tell us the truth. Okay? This is a social justice movement. So that first thing is you must create an environment where victims can tell you the truth. Okay? Because we're not used to telling you the truth. A, because sometimes we don't know what it is. B, because we really truly believe no one's going to believe us. And C, because we cannot imagine anyone would actually understand this the way it actually happens. So the burden is on all of us as helpers to create an environment where truth can be told. And I can talk a little bit about what that looks like later on. The second thing is that you have to also create an environment of accountability. So, you know, when we screw up, we got to say we screwed up. And we also have to help our systems and one another be held accountable when we're creating blocks and barriers for accessing services. We got to call it out. We got to call it out in ourselves, and we got to call it out with each other. So that's the nice thing about us partnering with CPS and law enforcement and them partnering with us. We're calling it out on each other. Here, we need you to do this to make these changes because we can't do our part. And without us working together, we don't know where the changes need to take place in our systems. We're all having the right idea, we all have the right intention, but we actually have systems that are counterproductive to us getting to that help that we all are trying to do. So there's that. And then the third thing is we have to change the conditions that cause the issue in the first place. This gender imbalance, this gender violence, this whole idea about men and women and who we are and what's power about, that has to change in our conditions. And so when we marry ourselves to our system partners, that's how we start to change the condition. You know, it's never been done in Sacramento County that a DV provider is training all 700 social workers. We did it. It's never been done that a DV agency is training law enforcement on the inside out. We're doing it. And here we are with you too, and you're doing it too. So we are right now creating environments where victims can tell us the truth. I really wanted us to understand that because this is a sociological issue, experienced personally, creating long-term psychological impact for our kids.
Did you want me just to touch? Okay, good. Okay. Just you're all familiar with the cycle of violence. Relationships begin in the honeymoon. That's why we move into them. So when the victim's in the honeymoon, she will present all is well, and this is, sidebar, the most empowered time to get help or change, where the change will be sustained. But no one really thinks they have a problem during the honeymoon, so no one walks into a DV provider during the honeymoon period. But I'm here to say if they would, that change would be easier and it would be more sustainable. What we're looking at, I think especially would be helpful for you, is that victim during tension building, because even though she might be removed again from that abuser, she still carries this cycle inside of her, so she could have lingering threats. He could be stalking. There's all sorts of things that can be happening where she's still going to be feeling the tension building. So she'll be, it'll be palpable energy that she will give off, nervous, reactive, anxiety, hyper-focused, questioning, and yes, victims become controlling because they have no control in their life. So when you're part of a system and you're asking questions, this is their chance to get some sort of a control back. So why do you need to know that? I just went there. Why do you need me to fill out this form again? I already filled out that form. Why are you making me do this? Don't you understand that I'm a victim? This is part of where they're at. This is part of their cycle.
So if an abuser tactic is to have power and control over that one person and then everyone else who gets in the way. Does that make sense? So if I want power and control over Robin, then I'm going to be controlling and manipulating everyone else to stay out of my way so I can stay focused over here. Does that make sense? All right. So that abuser is going to really do that. Here's what the survivor does. Survivor wants to have control over every situation she is in. She wants to have control over the situation. She knows she can't have control over the batterer. She knows she doesn't have control over the system or whatever the system's going to. So she's going to try to control the situation. All right? So sometimes I don't like your attitude. Sometimes I don't like the way you're talking to me. Sometimes I don't like the way you're looking. Sometimes I don't want to fill out 10 forms. Okay? Sometimes I don't. What are you talking about? I need to go parenting. Okay? Those are the ways I control the situation. Sometimes I'm going to poke at you. I'm going to put it out on you. So you feel like, okay, there she is. I'm trying to control a situation to have some sense of power and control in my own life because I don't have it anywhere else. So I need us to understand that because victims are hard to work with. Y'all know that, right? I'm telling you nothing new. Come on, y'all can be animated. Nobody's going to hold you accountable. You know what I'm saying? We are hard to work with. Let's just tell the truth. We are very some victims are not like holy martyring people. Okay? When you're trying to control a situation, you do whatever it takes to control that situation because it's life and death to you. Now, the sidebar to this is children try to control every situation too, including the victim and the perpetrator. So they're not just trying to control their lives, they're trying to control everybody else's life too because they even have a bigger investment in safety than adults. Make sense? So everybody be controlling everybody. So when you're sitting in front of a victim, you're like, well, she's just manipulating me. I feel all controlled. Yes, because Elaine just said she's trying to control the situation. So have some empathy. Now you got knowledge.
It's a completely different motivation. Again, abuser, person, victim, situation to situation. All right, Lainey. Okay, just a quick thing. So domestic violence is not an event. It is repeated incidents. We have to get through that. Sidebar, we just got law enforcement, when they're interviewing victims and abusers, they used to ask, were there any kids present during the incident. But now we've taught them that this is about an environment, so now law enforcement asks, are there any children in the household? That's a huge touchdown for us. That's a real huge touchdown. So the repeated incidents equal the pattern. Patterns create changes in personality. So if I put you in an environment, it is going to change your personality. So instead of being angry, you become an angry person, for a quick example. Patterns create the environment, and this is what we need to understand. Sometimes domestic violence can be a lifestyle. A lot of the victims that come in through our door are second, third, fourth, and even fifth generation. And so what's the challenge with that? If my grandma's grandma and so on was a victim, this whole issue is normalized. And so hence, I can't see something because I'm on the inside of it. Yeah.
Coping strategy.
No. There you go.
Right. Okay. So here's the last part of our review on adults' impact, right? So we really want to start to, you're starting to get the environment. Like some of you are like, I think I know that environment, and now I can understand it a little bit better. Here we go. So when you're living in this environment, okay, you create a whole set of strategies, of coping strategies. You gotta, otherwise you're gonna be nuts, right, on the other side of this thing. So you gotta learn how do I deal with things. So the first thing you do is you figure out this pattern. You absolutely figure out the pattern, and it is absolutely weirdly predictable. It's actually predictable. So as advocates can predict within 3 days that something's going to go down. We pretty much know. And we can get information from survivors to tell us when it's going to go down. We know that too. But children know it better than anyone else when it's going to go down. Okay, so we always have our plans. So the adults have their sort of strategy, and kids have their sort of strategy. Okay, so one of the first things to do is that when we have trauma, what's the main thing we're all trying to do? Because y'all have had trauma too, right? I mean, come on. Car accidents, loss in the family, whatever. Everybody's had trauma. When we have trauma, all of us have to create certain kinds of coping strategies, right? So some of us, go shopping. That's a good therapy for when we have trauma. Some of us, like, I just need to have me a glass of wine and sit down, right? Some of us need to do that. Some of us will pray, meditate. Some of us will isolate and withdraw. Some of us will eat. Some of us will self-medicate. Some of us will over-exercise. But all of those things are to help us cope, self-soothe us in a moment of trauma, correct? So they're not really necessarily unhealthy things to do. Now, here's the thing. In domestic violence, that doesn't end. So that trauma's daily. So you don't get to go back to your normal state of being like most of us would do if we've had a traumatic event. Eventually, we go back to some sense of normalcy to ourselves, correct? Yeah, but not in domestic violence because it doesn't ever end. It never ends. So all these things that I do, I drink, I dissociate, I have sex, I eat, I get angry, becomes rageful, all those things now become a lifestyle. They're not coping anymore. They are a lifestyle. You get that? Because if you keep doing this long enough, it changes you and this is the way you live. Once it becomes a lifestyle, which we all call risky behavior, it sets you up to be re-victimized again. So a lot of times survivors will say to me, do I just have this sign on my forehead? I'm like, well, sort of, kind of. Sort of, kind of we do. Sort of, kind of we're sending out this energy. Because you see, when I was sexually assaulted at 16, right, it was a hate crime, but I was assaulted at 16, but listen, if I have been abused all my life, I've developed some coping strategies, called dissociate, called only stay focused in this little tiny way and don't see everything else that's around me, the one Post-it note idea. I'm just living on the one Post-it note, okay? So when I stepped out into that parking lot from that high school, I was not aware of my surroundings. I'm just focused on go put your purse in the car and go back into the gym. See, because I only got my one focus, that's it. I'm not thinking this is a dangerous thing to do. In my home, I would have thought this is a dangerous thing to do. But I'm at school. I'm not thinking it should be a dangerous thing to do. So when I got jumped and assaulted and raped during that whole period of time, okay, I'm going to put this on me, like I caused this to happen. But later on, as I grew through my healing and I understand you're dissociated, how was you supposed to notice anything else? You weren't even supposed to notice that. And so this is what I mean by risky behavior. You're constantly set up for another round of victimization. If you don't break these coping strategies, they keep you in a state of vulnerability. Now, what's important to all of us? You never meet the person. The only person you're dealing with is the coping strategy. That's who's in your office. That's who's filing out the complaint, the claim. That's who you're trying to send for services, is the coping strategy. And so once we break through the coping strategies, which you cannot take away a coping strategy without replacing it with something that's healthier, that will work as fast as our survivor coping strategies. They got to work as good and as quickly. Okay? And once you can replace that, then that's the time to break those coping strategies. Here's a good example. It says CPS. You don't send people to AOD, to drug alcohol, if they're still living in violence and trauma. They will go whack. Get them out and get them safe first. So get into harm reduction stuff, not into, do you understand, instead of abstinence. Never take away a coping strategy from someone, because this is helping them cope without losing their sanity. Replace it first. And understand that domestic violence impacts you holistically. Not just, we want to own your mind, but once I get your mind, I got everything else. So it impacts you holistically. Intense example, but got to give it to you anyway. Okay? When I was 3, my mom was very ill. She had tuberculosis. I'm the oldest child. I was put in a Catholic receiving home in Denver. My sister was 19 months old. I'm a little over 3. This is where a lot of abuse happened in this little orphanage place where I was living. And I was also raped at 3 by a priest in this Catholic receiving home. All right? It's not so much that, though that's big. It's what was said. God will never listen to you. You were born a sin. And that's the way we thought about multiracial children back then. Because, you know, it was against the law to have interracial marriages. I don't know if you know that, till 1947. Okay? So, and this is 1955 or so. So that meant, even at that young age, I did not believe I could even pray to something bigger than my fear. And so when I tell you that this issue affects us holistically, every survivor has to believe in something bigger than her own fear and trauma. And if that something bigger also abused you, you got nowhere to go. So why would I believe in you? Why would I believe in you when I can't believe in something bigger than you? Does that make sense? So I want us to understand the mountain the survivor is climbing. And then the bigger mountain range a child has to climb. That child has to climb like the Himalayas, while we're just trying to get over here to this, what is that butte that we got over here? Some little small butte we all can climb up, even me. A child has to get like she's climbing Mount Everest. And that's the pitch she has to come out. And that's why children require more mental health services than actually the adults. Okay, so we always say that every adult victim absolutely needs domestic violence specific counseling, not therapy, counseling. But every child needs some therapy, because their brain is being actively changed right now, and we can do something to change that back or mitigate the damage. So I wanted us to understand those coping strategies, because that's all you're meeting. And maybe one day that healing will take place and that person will become themselves and be brave enough to be themselves for you to know, but you don't have that privilege to know them. And they don't, because they don't even know themselves to show you. Does it make sense? Right. Any questions thus far before I turn it over to Dave? Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Yes, yes, yes. Dave will get into a little bit of that as we start to move into the kids, the kinds of things that we have found that work well, and the kinds of things that we're kind of doing over at ACFP that are kind of mitigating that. But I wanted to do that, okay? So Dave is sort of like my little brother. Yeah. Oh, you want to stand up and stretch? Okay, let's stand up and stretch, do a little qigong. Okay, here we go. No, they can't. Little qigong thing that we do with everyone here. Okay, I'll just show you. And I know sometimes it's a heavy subject, and it's sometimes really hard to hear all this stuff, but I always just say this: it's much harder to live in it. So we'll just remember that. It's as hard as it is for us to hear it, it's so much friggin' harder to be a kid in it. So we'll just remember that, right? And you also remember, if it's difficult for you to hear this, then you just magnify that 100-fold, and you might get a clue about what that child is feeling. Because it's real hard to hear the crap in your own home, especially from people who are supposed to love you, right? So Dave and I met a while back, quite a few years ago, right? And he asked me to keynote in one of his conferences that he did, and then I'm usually known for sharing my childhood story. So as it turns out, we're kindred spirits in that same way, and we found our artistic, creative way to handle our journey. When I met him and he first introduced in a more academic way the trauma impact to kids, it sort of liberated me. It liberated me as a child. It liberated the part of me that's been impacted from thinking I'm forever broken, and that I can be okay because I learned this one piece that's finally been researched about my own brain and my own life. And so I'll forever be grateful for Mr. Dave for bringing that to me, because he brought a piece of that Post-it note back to me and brought a piece of my brain back to me and a sense of wholeness. He has been one of the most valuable members of our team, and as I said to him, I don't care when the grant ends, you never leave a community for peace. You are part of our community and helping us to make really big systemic change, not just for us, but for Sacramento County. So it's my great honor to have him be part of this team and share now the COP social worker that he is with all of us. And so we just call him Professor Dave. So Professor, if you'll just go ahead and take that right over.
Thank you, Elaine. I have to take a deep breath. I've heard Elaine and Robin many times, and I think I always learn something new. I hope you're learning something too. Good afternoon. How are you? I wanted to start, first of all, what Mika said about my background is true, but more accurately, I started out as a cop in 1979. So I was a young patrol officer during the years where, as Elaine said, we had no laws on domestic violence. We didn't talk about domestic violence. We didn't use that term. We didn't talk about spousal abuse or children exposed. Success for us was getting the male half of the dispute to pack a few things and leave for the night. And if the children woke up during our presence there, we would just ask them to go back to sleep. Everything would be okay in the morning. And then we would leave without even writing a police report. So we've seen a lot of changes. I can say that we've seen a lot of really terrific changes, both legally and in practice and in training. We're doing a lot of really terrific things. I'll be able to highlight a few during my presentation, but we still have a long way to go. But what Elaine said about the past and how we used to address domestic violence is not very flattering from a law enforcement perspective. So in 1979, I became a police officer, and boy, what a great career this has been for me. I've done a whole lot of great things as a cop, but in 2000, I earned my MSW from Sac State with a focus in child and family welfare. Really opened up a new world for me. I did my 1,200 hours of intern work in working with foster children as well as working with CPS, emergency response. And it's probably been the highlight of my career to work with people, passionate people such as Mika and Elaine and Robin of others, and to help co-found the Domestic Violence Prevention Collaboration and be here today to talk to you. Where I'm at now is with the Citrus Heights Police Department. I'm a reserve officer there, and I co-coordinate a grant on children exposed to domestic violence. At the police department then, with this grant, our partners are ACFP, Community for Peace, and CPS. And together, we do what we can to improve our response, our preliminary investigations, our reporting, our presence, our professionalism, our prosecutions of cases of DV involving children, as well as our follow-up and delivery of services. So you can see why ACFP and CPS and the police department have to work together to accomplish some of these goals. Before I continue, I don't know, how much you want to disclose, but this is a new audience for me. So you've had some great information on some of the implications and intricacies of domestic violence. But before I continue, I'd like to ask you, based on what you've heard so far, is there anything you see or you hear in the course of your duties that you want to present to me or to us so that I can sort of polish my comments a little bit and direct them more appropriately as they would apply to you and what you do in the course of your jobs? Any comments? Anything you'd like me to know? Okay. Are you all supervisors? No? Do you have a supervisor here? Would you like me to ask her to leave? I don't know. Maybe they'd be more engaged if we did. Just kidding. Okay. So where I'd like to start here, okay. I always digress, so this I won't digress too badly here. But as Elaine said earlier, if you do have any questions at any time, or if I tend to digress too much and it doesn't apply to what you do, feel free to raise your hand and stop me and let us know, how what we're talking about can more effectively apply to what you do on a regular basis. At the bottom of this slide is a quote by Dr. Bruce Perry, 2002, who is the founder and director of the Child Trauma Academy, and he's developed research on brain mapping. It's a neurological perspective that allows them to identify effects of trauma on children's brains, on the growing brain. He calls it the neurosequential model of therapy. And in this training, he says that in some respects, neglect is more toxic long-term than physical trauma. This is important because when it comes to children exposed to domestic violence, sometimes I hear comments like, well, it was verbal only, right? Or they were asleep, they were in the back room, they didn't hear anything. Or it wasn't physical. Or if it was physical, this is the first time it's been physical. Other than that, it was verbal only. Now, I don't want to cuss, and I don't want to get too graphic here, but in your minds, you've heard Robin and Elaine talk about the nature of isolation and control and how parasitic some of these controllers can be. Can you imagine some of the things that come out of their mouths? Can you imagine how venomous some of the words are that they use in this verbal-only confrontation? Can you imagine what these children might hear? In some respects, neglect is more toxic long-term than physical trauma. A side note, I facilitated grief recovery support groups for almost 6 years, and I dealt with a lot of wonderful people who lost loved ones in some horrific ways. And many times they would ask me, when am I going to be normal again? When can I get back to my old life? And I would facilitate discussions to get them to accept that their life will not necessarily ever be normal again. It will never be what it was. It's changed. And what is your new life going to look like? This is very hard to accept in grief recovery, especially when you have family, neighbors, or friends that are expecting you to get over it because it's already been 3 years. Let me ask you, if I could, without disclosure, and you don't have to raise your hand, but how many people here have lost loved ones? How long did it take you to get over that? You never do. Life has changed. It will never be the same. And how frustrating is it for other people to suggest to you that you should have been over it by now? It's been long enough. So I'd like to start with this concept in mind. How long does it take children to get over it? Dr. Robert Geffner in 2003, highly published in the area of abuse and trauma in children exposed to domestic violence, suggests that there's a number of things that complicate a child's ability to cope with trauma. The one is severity. How severe is the trauma? And that could be being involved physically, or it could be witnessing trauma being inflicted on somebody else, typically father, stepfather, or boyfriend to mom. Or it could be even the nature of verbal only. Now, I could have a couple of actors up here role-playing an argument. And I could write a script for them, and I'm also a fiction writer, so I could write a real good script. And they could really get into a venomous, a disgusting, name-calling argument back and forth. And I could ask you to pay attention while this is going on. It'd be very difficult to do that. Or I could put them out on the hallway where you wouldn't see it, and you just would hear it. What images would be going through your mind? Maybe even you would hear something go bump, and you would wonder, what's that? And you would develop images in your mind to create or finish or paint texture, otherwise texture this argument that you're hearing in the hallway. So severity can be a number of different things. It's also associated with age. Age is important because when we're born, when we're infants, our mind is a primal, our brain is a primal brain. Dr. Kate Messina at Sacramento refers to it as a reptilian brain. Right? Our brain is fight or flight. It's that brain stem in the lower brain that's designed to pick up on threats and also seek comfort. Infants want to seek love, touch, food, warmth, security. When they don't see these things, when they don't feel these things, they get frightened. They feel threatened and they cry. Now, our brains develop neural pathways to higher cognitive functioning. And the way our brains do that is based on the development of that primal brain. So if a brain is exposed to comfort, love, touch, food, warmth, attachment, then we can develop healthy neural pathways to higher cognitive functioning. We can think, we can process, we can plan, we can anticipate, we can develop critical thinking skills, we can compare and contrast. But if our brain is stuck in a fight or flight perspective, then what kind of neural pathways do you think we're developing? How does that higher cognitive functioning look? Okay, it is lacking critical thinking skills, lacking the ability to compare and contrast, lacking the ability to plan. It's more emotional, more responsive, stuck in fight or flight. Or some of these youngsters, as Elaine said, completely detach. They internalize the violence. And as they do so, they present even sometimes with detachment or seizure disorders, because they're so good at detaching what they perceive as threats. So age is real important. Just because a child is 8 months and they're in a crib doesn't mean they're not being affected by some of this venomous verbal only, or something that is more serious than verbal only, even including watching or listening to other people get into a fight. I recently followed up on a police case where mom and dad were in a verbal only argument. The child was in the other room sleeping, 8-month-old, and dad went into the room, decided to throw mom's clothes out the window, and then mom reciprocated and threw his things out the window, and pretty soon everything went out the window. And you can imagine what they're saying back and forth. This is the same room that the child was sleeping in. So age is important in that respect, but in the other respect, the older children tend to get involved. So when you see children who are 9, 10, 11 years old, I would say, okay, when have you tried to get involved? 12, 13, 14 years old? When have you tried to get involved? I had a media clip that we're not able to play for you. It's a 14-year-old that called 911. And it's not traumatic in the sense that she's yelling and screaming and crying. She's very calm. In fact, dispatch had to call her back. And she picked up the phone and said, yeah, hi, this is 911. Did you just call? What's your emergency? Well, they're fighting again. Okay, who's fighting? Oh, mom and stepdad. And any violence? Well, no, not really. He did grab her hair and throw her to the ground, but other than that, nothing major. She normalized that behavior pretty well. Okay, this has happened yeah, it happens a lot. I kind of know when to call the police in order to keep it from getting worse, like it did in the past. And she's talking to you as if she's just taken a dose of Ativan and she's feeling terrific. And she's 14 years old. This is how she gets involved. How long does it take her to get over that? How long has she been exposed? How severe has it been in the past? How long would it take her to get over that? Who knows? This is why we use therapists, and we do take the opinion of therapists. But when you're working with somebody like this, the idea of getting over it may be never. Her life may be changed completely, and she might have to redefine who she is as she gets older. As Elaine said, when you're detached and you don't know the difference between right or wrong, and you think that your mom, who is supposed to be protecting you, is maybe nuts, maybe she's the one, maybe, well, no, I don't know. Well, then how do you define yourself, in terms of a person, a human being? What are your aspirations and your goals in life? May not have any. So somebody like this 14-year-old, it may take her years, it may take her the rest of her life to get over this and to redefine who she is as a person, and what she can accomplish in life as well. So we have severity, we have age, and we have frequency. Severity, age, frequency, of course. How often does this occur? Take, if you will, the example that I just gave you about a couple of actors role-playing a horrible argument out on the hallway, and you're listening to this. And I'm up here asking you to pay attention because I got things I want you to learn. And you're hearing this in the background. Well, now suppose you're 12 years old and this is something you hear every Friday, Saturday, Sunday nights. And it's now Thursday at school, and you're thinking, okay, tomorrow night, Dad gets home, the drinking, the fighting, the things, and now I've got to check on Mom Saturday morning, see what kind of injury she has. And I'm up here as a teacher telling you, as a 12-year-old, to pay attention. And something wrong with you, you just don't get it. You zone out. Maybe you're ADD. Maybe your disability have learning disabilities. There's something wrong here because you're just not paying attention. Okay. So frequency is important. Maybe it happens every night. Maybe Dad has been laid off. Maybe he got fired. Maybe he lost his job. Maybe he's got an alcohol problem, a drug problem. Maybe it happens every night. Maybe, it just has happened once in the last 3 years and it's okay. I'm getting through it and I have role models in my life that can help me get over it. Or maybe it doesn't. Maybe it happens every day and here I am, a 12-year-old at school, trying to pay attention, doing what people are asking me to do, think about my brain and the way my brain is developed. Perhaps I'm a little hypersensitive to this now aggressive instructor. Okay, and now I'm not listening to anything they say because they represent a threat to me. Or perhaps their over-aggressiveness is causing me to detach. And now I'm just tuning that all together. I'm thinking about the horrible weekend coming up. So severity, frequency, age, and sort of a co-occurring element is what role do I play? Because many times children are involved, they get involved, or maybe as they get older they wish they would have gotten involved. A lot of kids as they get older look back and say, boy, I wish I would have gotten involved. I wish I would have told him off, or I wish I would have done something to protect my mom or my sister. So role is very important. Yes, ma'am. It can. Dr. Bruce Perry suggests that boys mostly tend to externalize the violence. They tend to become hypervigilant. They tend to recognize the threat and act out more than young girls. And also they may tend to identify with the aggressor. Most of the time it's men. So even though they see the violence, they may identify with the role of the aggressor. And by externalizing and becoming hypervigilant, you see them present as ADHD or conduct disorder, sometimes bipolar, antisocial, fights. And I'll bring the slide up in a few minutes, but Dr. Bruce Perry says that we create the environment. We create an affect in our environment that's presented back to us. So if I'm a 12-year-old boy and I externalize and I become aggressive and I see threats where otherwise other kids or peers don't see threats, but Elaine mentioned this early on, I pick up on body language. I can tell by the way you're looking at me or by the way you're standing, and I see a threat. Or the tone of your voice, not what you're saying, but the tone of your voice. So I'm going to externalize that. I'm going to pick up on the threat, and I'm going to become more aggressive. And I'm going to get into fights. I'm going to be labeled as antisocial or worse. And this affect or this emotional environment will be reflected back at me. I won't have any friends, and the friends I do have will be risk takers or other children who engage in the same time externalizing behavior. Dr. Bruce Perry also suggests that more girls tend to internalize exposure to violence. They tend to detach or dissociate from the violence. They're seen sometimes in school as not paying attention. Maybe there'll be several tasks that they have to complete for a particular assignment, and they're okay. They start on task number 1, and then they just kind of forget where they're at. So they're labeled as slow. They don't pay attention, and the more aggressive you get with them in school, the more detached they become, and the more they internalize their behavior.
Can I add in here just a
second?
Yeah, please. I wanted to add the backdrop of the cultural pieces of it. Remembering that I talk about male privilege and talking about how this was legal in our country. So if you think about that, and I'm a male child, you want to identify with that which is powerful, not that which is weak. You get that, everybody? Like, if you had a powerful person here and a weak person, what are you going to be like? I want to be like the weak person? No, none of us wants to do that. So I want us to understand that, too, that we still have a male-dominated sort of culture. We do. I know, no offense, guys. I love that you're here because you're making the change. You are making the change. But I want us to also understand this is 1981. So our culture hasn't changed all that. Get what I'm saying? So if I'm a boy child in a home and I have an entire environment, culture, media, everything that glorifies that kind of power, you know, i.e. our NFL, i.e., you know, where we're now seeing all of that show up. Okay, I want to identify with the powerful, not the weak. When I'm a kid, I've already ID'd this before I'm 2 years old. Who's the powerful one? I'm going to be like them because there's no way I'm going to be that weak. Even girl children will come to that. But here's the other part of it is that we also know from research that male children, well, let me just go back to this. How do we learn domestic violence? Through our observation. We learn domestic violence through experience and experiment and reinforcement. So if I hit you and nothing bad happens to me, and I ask you to shut up and I hit you and it works and nothing bad happens to me, hey, there's a technique. There's a skill that's going in my bag. I know how to get you to shut up anytime I want to. Just hit you and you will. All right? So I learn it from that. I also learn it from culture, and culture is male, female. Our gender is a culture. We learn it from there too. We learn it in our families, and we learn it in our communities, our schools, our entertainment, and our media. We are a country that glorifies violence. We understand that violence is the way we solve problems and the way we get entertained. So we have to understand where are they getting that from. So the impact to your question is male children who engage in intimate partner violence, dating violence, adolescent teen violence when they're 12 and 13 years old, if they get a charge on that, do you know that's a crime that's not expunged from their records ever. You can be 18, you're still going to carry that charge. Why? Because if you're hitting somebody under 18, you are 1,000% more likely to hit someone over 18. And boy children are far more impacted in domestic violence as in producing other abusers than girl children. Girl children, on the other hand, by the age of 2 or 3, have already identified, if I'm a girl and I don't get privilege in this culture and I'm not held up and I'm not special and I'm just a piece of trash like my mother, then I've already identified I'm powerless before I'm in kindergarten. Okay, so I need us to understand that gender does play a factor here because it's in the backdrop of the context of our culture at large. And that's why we have to work, kind of like you were saying, you got to work policy and training, you got to do training, you got to change laws, you got to do all of it at the same time in order for us to really make an impact here. So it is that, and I think in our shelter we have examples of little boys, particularly 2 and 3 years old, who actually intervened on mom being strangled. Right? In this one case in particular I'm thinking of, this little boy broke up the violence while the abuser his dad was strangling the mom in the bathroom. And this 3-year-old just jumped on top of the dad to stop it. That child and has a 10-month-old sibling, so mom and the 2 children come into shelter. In 72 hours, you see this little kid up on mom's lap, you know, wanting to give a hug, but doing this to the mom, strangling the mom. This is a 3-year-old. Because you learn what you see. You learn from your environment. So yes, ma'am, it affects boy children a little bit more in that aggressive way because we have a culture that supports that.
And I'll come back to your question in a couple of slides. But hopefully I've given you some idea of what I've read anyhow in the literature. And to finish up on the young girls that Dr. Perry tend to internalize, he even goes so far as to suggest that some of these girls who internalize and detach present with seizure disorders because it can be so severe.
I think also in our culture we have this thing where you have more girls doing violence to each other in high school because that's where we can't do it to the guys, so we're just going to take it out on one another. So you're going to see that a lot of girls are ganging this way on one another because, as I like to say, you know, crap flows downhill. So you always pick on the one that has less power than you.
And I should be done with my section here within 15 or 20 minutes. We do this a lot, and we present for different audiences, so we're winging it from time to time, and actually we tend to go over most of the time. So I guess you can plan on being here until 5 or 6 o'clock, but I'm sure you don't mind. Just checking. And so this is important. The understanding, this all leads to back what Robin said about an environment. And I won't get into it too much, but in law enforcement, we see domestic violence as an incident. It's the way the law is written. An incident, an assault, an attempted assault. That's what we see. But when children are involved, it's an environment, right? You can tell by now that we're not talking about an incident. We're talking about the way they live on a regular basis. So this training is the same training that we're presenting for law enforcement, primarily right now in Citrus Heights, but we're expanding that. And we want to be aware of asking children if they're afraid. For example, are you afraid? Many times kids say, well, I was scared. I tell my officer, go further. Scared of what? Scared of whom? What do you think would happen if we weren't here right now? Find out what's inside their mind. How are they internalizing? How are their brains handling this argument, this verbal only, things that go bump in the night? I'll talk about that more in a few minutes. What are you afraid of? Do you feel safe at home? Has anyone in your family been hit? Has anyone in your family been threatened? How do you sleep at night? Is your house a safe place for you? Does anyone call you names? These are a combination of questions I picked up from the literature as well as things that I know are important and can elucidate more information on the environment over my years of experience. Do you like to read? Do you like to play? How do you occupy non-structured time? What is your favorite game to play? What do you do when you get angry? Do you know anyone who has weapons? A risk factor, obviously, or access to weapons. Children will hear, so many times there's threats. I'll shoot you. If a child hears somebody says, I'll shoot you, then they think weapon. Well, I don't know, but I've heard somebody mention that they'll shoot another person, so I think they have a weapon. How are you punished? How do you like school? Tell me about your friends. How do you like your friends? Who do you play with? How do you sleep at night? Do you hear yelling and screaming? What is it like when mom and dad disagree? And how often does this occur? So understanding the nature of the environment and what children are exposed to is more significant than understanding that a particular incident has occurred. And sometimes we all do this because we respond to incidents and we have to go past that. Yes, sir. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. It depends on the age, and it also depends on how they've normalized this environment. Robin mentioned this as well. Sometimes in CPS, sometimes in advocacy, sometimes in law enforcement, we get real frustrated with our victims and children because they just seem to minimize their environment. They just don't seem to think it's that significant or that severe. And it dawned on me one afternoon or one morning when I was in a DV death review team meeting, and we were discussing a death, a situation where a woman had gotten shot. And prior to her murder, she was in a relationship, a second relationship. Her first one was domestic violence related. She's in another one, and as you heard Elaine say, the lifestyle seems to perpetuate this cycle. So she was in a second relationship, and she wanted to break up, and that during separation, as we know, is some of the most dangerous times for a victim exposed to domestic violence. That's when things can really hit the fan. That's when the suspect tends to lose control and they try to get it back. That's when the threats get very bad, pervasive, persistent, and the violence can occur. Which she didn't recognize that. She just thought, well, I'm going to separate from this guy and I'm going to let him stay in the house. It was her house. He's going to stay in another room and I'll stay in this room. We see these as risk factors, but she didn't see them as risk factors. She just thought this is the way you cope with, life. She even went so far as to put a lock on her door. And her family knew she had a lock on her door. So she's in her second domestic violence relationship. She's breaking up with the suspect. She lets him stay in the house, and she puts a lock on her door. Okay, and you might say, well, she's minimizing the significance or the threat that's present to her. But in reality, she wasn't, because she didn't realize that these are risk factors. This is just life for her. And so we have to understand that, as Robin said, sometimes people tend to normalize their environment. They don't see any other environment. They don't know how to compare and contrast to other healthy environments. This is just life for them. And if we assume that victims and children are minimizing, then that kind of puts the blame on them for not becoming successful in life or not accepting services. And it kind of gives us a way out. Well, they're just minimizing it. They don't quite want to admit to the situation they're involved in. But if we ask some of these questions, and we do our best to elucidate the environment they're exposed to, we can see sometimes that they're not minimizing, but they're normalizing the environment. And that's kind of scary, because then that tells us that they don't know enough about domestic violence to understand the risk factors. And Elaine mentioned this as well. It's not about AOD. It's not about family therapy. It's not about any other kind of therapy, but it's about understanding the implications and intricacies of domestic violence. So the way a child or even adult would respond to some of these questions tells us how they feel, how trauma has affected them, and so it can help us in a number of different ways. And sometimes when we get responses from children and they shrug their shoulders, it just encourages us to go about it another way and ask the questions in a different way, maybe ways that they can understand. And I'll get to this, well, I'll get to it now, I think, but I think it's important also to say that, I mentioned grief, and a number of you raised your hands and said you never get over the loss of a loved one, but other people sometimes expect you to, don't they? And when I was doing grief recovery, many divorces occurred, and family members distanced themselves because of the arguments that took place based on how I would expect you to get over your grief. Well, you should be over it by now. Okay, creates conflict. And this projection is something we use in domestic violence and CDV as well. And being in law enforcement, I've seen, it's not flattering, but I've seen, and I've heard the cops who just shake their head and say, why does she stay? What's wrong with her? Right? Why does she just stay? I don't understand. Well, I've had one cop tell me that I'll give them the first one, but the second one's on them, meaning return calls for service. Now I blame her. And this is a type of projection as well. I'm projecting on her what she should be doing based on my brain, based on my sense of logic. In reality, there's no evidence to suggest that your brain and her brain are anything alike. But we do that. All of us do it. And so that's why it's important to understand the difference between normalizing and minimizing and being non-judgmental. A trauma-informed perspective, which is now being adopted by the state International Association of Chiefs of Police, tells us to understand how victims and children are affected by trauma, not how you may be affected by trauma. And the more you can do to understand that, the better that we can intervene, the better we can investigate, the better reports, the better delivery of services. And I'll probably wrap up in a few minutes and talk more about that. Okay, I want to advance these slides here. No, I want to go back. Okay. No, where do I point this at? Okay, this slide is what I call the pillow effect. And that's not a clinical term. That's a term that I made up. And what it represents is that 12-year-old child trying to sleep at night with the pillow wrapped over her ears because she doesn't want to hear the screaming, yelling, the verbal only, or the things that go bump in the night. And again, based on the example I gave you can imagine if you're 12 years old, not seeing it, but just hearing it, what kind of thoughts you might put to what you're listening to. And you could create horrific images in your mind that may be not completely delusional, based on the real events occurring between the conflict. So this is the pillow effect. This is the environment that children are exposed to. The term that I have seen in the literature more often than not is the word chaotic. It's chaos. So I looked at the literature and I tried my best to define what chaos really means in the environment of children exposed to domestic violence. Chaos. And remember, before I continue, the developing brain doesn't want chaos. We don't develop very healthy neural pathways to higher cognitive functioning when we're exposed to chaos. We want calm. We want peace. We want rhythmic pattern soothing. We want touch. We want love. We want attachment. We want food. We want warmth. Just the opposite of that is chaos. Chaos is disordered. It's unpredictable. It's disruptive. It's inconsistent. It's impulsive. It lacks pattern soothing rhythm. It's violent. It's threatening. It's yelling, profane, screaming, terrorizing, tense, life-threatening. Chaos is distrust, judgmental, hateful, suspicious, negative. It's violating, manipulative. It's dishonest, expletive. It confuses roles where children become parentified. Children may feel powerless, helpless. They feel abandoned. They feel isolated. Some of this may go back to your question about how do boys cope differently than girls. It's not uncommon to feel helpless as a youngster, but as a boy, as I grow, and I'm taught that boys protect other people. Now I look back and maybe I feel guilty that I didn't protect my sister or my mother or the dog that was kicked or killed. And as I get older, I become stronger. I decide I'm not going to let this happen again. So I might overreact to things that I perceive as threats and become hyper-aggressive to kind of soothe the sense of guilt that I might have. It's insulting. Chaos is blaming, degrading, rejecting, disrespectful, shaming. Chaos is accusatory, confrontational, aggressive, primal, and that's where we get that emotionally responsive, hyper-aggressive, hyper-vigilant type of behavior. This is chaos. This is the environment that children live in. And if they don't see it, they hear it. Verbal only, at least at the Citrus Heights Police Department, doesn't really fly anymore. We're teaching our officers to go past verbal only. And this is where we have a battle with minimizing or normalizing. Because being called some of these names, this environment is normal. So if I'm a cop and I'm asking somebody, well, what was the argument about? She says, well, we do this all the time. Well, a police report shouldn't say we do this all the time. It should identify things that are chaotic. It's real important, especially when children are involved. But as a victim, it may take prodding. It may take a police officer asking me, I don't understand, tell me more, for me to give them the information to identify the fact that it is, in fact, a chaotic environment that our children are exposed to. Also, I think this is important, and this is a secondary citation. I have not read this research personally, but a 2004 study showed that children who were exposed to domestic violence as adults have reported exposure to substance abuse, have reported exposure to sexual abuse, have reported exposure to mental illness, psychological abuse, and have reported exposure to physical abuse. Meaning that domestic violence, or as some say in academia, interpersonal violence, is a significant predictor of a child physical and emotional abuse and neglect. So the chaos, if you can imagine this from this pillow effect perspective, is just overwhelming. There may be associated factors that the child is exposed to as well. So just the fact that the child is exposed to domestic violence is an indicator, a risk factor to us that they could be exposed to other harm as well. How long does it take to get over this? Yes, ma'am. Right. Right. Yeah, it does. You're absolutely correct. Because the law for us defines domestic violence as abuse. An assault, an attempted assault, sometimes threats, criminal threats, and sometimes violations of restraining order, stalking. But primarily it is an assault-based perspective that law enforcement has. If it's verbal only, if it's psychological, if it's emotional, if it's based on spiritual or religious perspectives, it doesn't necessarily qualify as something law enforcement would respond to. Where we're changing that when children are involved is that children, because of what we know about domestic violence and the developing brain, is that when children are exposed to some of this verbal only, then that exposure can be considered mental suffering, which is a violation of legislation or the penal code section on child trauma. That's probably why they would ask our children involved. Otherwise, it would not be something we would tend to respond to. Does that answer your question?
Well, yes, but it's also the reason why I think we're doing this trauma-informed kind of stuff. Because we remember that when the domestic violence laws were created, when we made domestic violence a crime in 1981, it had to go through the physical door. It had to go through the physical assault door. 273.5. It's a felony. We had to go through that door because nobody could get the rest of it. Okay, and so now here we are, about 30 years later. Now we're getting the rest of it. That we understand that physical assault is only one step next to homicide. There's a whole bunch of other crap that happened before that to make that physical assault that violent and that traumatic. So we're still changing people's minds and expanding their understanding, and unfortunately the Bickermans are still there, and you may have to move unless they move, you know what I'm saying? Or you just keep calling. And that's the other thing. While it's annoying to us, you have to keep calling. Because homicides happen this way. There's no homicide in Sacramento County through domestic violence that the cops didn't know about before. 5 to 7 times they have been to that home before that murder takes place. Women get hurt when they leave, not when they stay. They get hurt when they leave, not when they stay. Right? So, well, because loss of power and control. That's it. And so when if you are my object of power and control, my only goal is to get it back. And I'll do whatever it takes to do that. So remembering the power and control piece is that. But no, that's why when we ask the question, why do women stay? Because it's safer sometimes for us to stay than it is for us to leave.
Yeah, and I don't want to digress into some of the penal code sections, but if you'd like to stick around when we're done, I'd be happy to tell you about what maybe some of your options are not related to domestic violence. And I have an anecdote. I don't want to, if I could briefly, there's a situation similar to that, but there were kids involved. And a neighbor who was a licensed clinical social worker happened to talk to the wife one afternoon and say, listen, I hear this argument. I just want you to know that I hear it, some other neighbors hear it, and I hope you're okay. Well, the wife disclosed to the neighbor that she was being abused and assaulted. And the neighbor, who was an LCSW, felt she was a mandated reporter, filed a mandated report form with the police department. We investigated. I had an investigator contact covertly the neighbors and another investigator contact workers. And I put together a case with an arrest warrant on her husband without ever talking to her. I put together a search warrant without ever talking to her. We went to the house, arrested him. I had an officer and a social worker talk to her. We convinced her to work with us. He pled guilty within 8 days and was put on probation and actually skipped probation and went down to Southern California. We had a restraining order against him. She was well on the road to recovery just because a neighbor decided to get involved. Later on, 2 years later, that same guy killed his new girlfriend, is now doing life in prison for homicide. So there are some, with my experience, you know, I can see there may be a what if here or there, but I'd be happy to talk to you after the presentation if you want to stick around. And this is kind of the connection here between children involved in domestic violence, because it is an incident-based type of response. the penal code section that allows us to add charges to or arrest somebody for child neglect is more qualitative than the assault. Domestic violence for us is there has to be an assault or an attempted assault. That's pretty quantitative. But when children are involved, we're looking for mental suffering. Okay, whenever somebody permits a child to suffer or presents an environment that produces mental suffering, we can arrest somebody for this charge, but that's more qualitative. In order to do that, again, you can see how important it is to elucidate the environment. You can understand why it's so important to understand all of these implications and intricacies that we're talking about, because that all makes up the environment where an expert then in court could say that environment would produce mental suffering. Okay. Trauma is mental suffering. Dr. Bruce Perry says maltreated and traumatized children, for a variety of reasons, tend to be more impulsive. They struggle developmentally and are awkward socially. They will age, but they won't develop. And this might go back to, ma'am, your question about boys and girls, and this is the information from Dr. Bruce Perry. And we have, I mentioned before, the externalizing aggressive behavior, which is, we typically see more with boys, related behavior that we see more with women. Down at the bottom are two quotes from Dr. Perry. The first one on the left is, you will create an affective climate by the way you act. You project to the world and elicit from other people the things you have inside. So this creates the cycle. This creates the lifestyle that Elaine was talking about. You can't act like this. You can't be hypervigilant and be in a state of fight or flight. You can't pick up on nonverbal cues. You can't be emotionally reactive. You can't be overly sensitive, and you can't be self-centered without creating an effective response from the society that you're exposed to. And that creates a continued cycle of problematic behavior with problematic peers. And on the other hand, on the quote on the right says, fainting and referrals for potential seizure disorder are the most common ways that dissociative children end up in the public system. So sometimes the isolation, the ability to, you present as somebody who lacks motivation. You can't follow instructions. You may have eating disorders, poor self-image. You're behind or slow in school. You're isolated and quiet. You're hard to engage. Sometimes even cutting behavior. You can't project this type of behavior to the environment around you without eliciting an effective response. And this is why it's so important to address the environment children live in, because if we don't, this is just going to continue. And one more here. Putting it all together, I think you can kind of see where we're going with this information. My role on children exposed to domestic violence is to expand our understanding, to develop an appreciation for the environment that children live in. From a law enforcement officer's perspective, you can definitely see how this would apply. Hopefully you can see how it would apply to your role. However, I don't know your role that well, so if you have any questions, or if after our presentation you want to ask more specific questions, please feel free to do that. And Dr. Perry says resilient children are born. They're not born. Resilient children are not born, they are made. Okay, so as a society, I believe that we have an obligation to our children. And when children are involved in domestic violence, we have an obligation to understand that. We have an obligation to respond as professionally as possible, to investigate as comprehensively as possible, to report. And this, not just police reports, but CPS reports, and anybody who has to create a narrative on an environment that includes children exposed to domestic violence. The elements of your narrative, the comprehensiveness of your narrative, that's based on your understanding of the implications and intricacies of domestic violence and children exposed. That's part of being professional and part of doing the best job that we can do. And that brings me back to my original slide. So before I turn it over to Elaine and Robin, questions? Yes, ma'am.
repeat the question.
Yeah, certainly. If I understand you correctly, you're saying that your actions depend a lot on what you read in police reports. So how extensive is our training? How well are police officers being trained on this information, allowing them then to prepare a report that allows you to do your job? That's how you make your decision. So let me be real honest with you, and I can guarantee you that all three of us will be extremely honest with you. And I've been around over 35 years now. I'm seeing some really terrific reports, and I compliment officers all the time. However, we see sometimes reports that are not flattering. And one of the things that I do is that I'm able to communicate with the patrol sergeant and the domestic violence detective, as well as advocates and CPS, and I point out the deficiencies in the police report. And Robin will talk about this, but our DVERT team, the domestic violence response team, which is a trained officer and a trained advocate, will go back out and follow up. That's what we're trying to do. We understand that not every situation in the field is conducive to a real comprehensive report. Some officers have things to do. Some officers just have that projection that doesn't allow them always to be as comprehensive as possible. So I know that in Citrus Heights, the information is out. We're seeing some great reports. Our filing rates from the DA's office are improving. I know that when I work for SAC-PD, we had one of the highest filing rates in the county of Sacramento, but I'm not privy to the quality of reports in other agencies throughout Sacramento. But we are doing a lot. This training that you're being exposed to is the training that everybody in Citrus Heights is exposed to, and we have a procedure in place to deal with reports that are less than comprehensive for whatever reason. We'll get officers and advocates back out there to clarify and present to us supplements to that report. So if you get a police report and you have a lot of questions, it's possible that a follow-up may have been done, and it's maybe something you could do would be to call or contact somebody in the department and ask if there's any follow-up that's been done.
I would say this about that, because how widespread is it? We hope it will get widespread. This is a template that this is a pilot project. There's only 3 in the state of California that are working this particular grant. Yeah, 3. And there were 4, but there's 3 remaining. And we're really at the top at being able to create customized training, et cetera, et cetera. So we're hoping in a couple years that this template that we're shaping will go countywide, Sacramento countywide, and we're working with the district attorney's office, et cetera, et cetera. So I wish I could say it's statewide, it's countywide, but it's going to go there. I think you have the responsibility of pushing back and saying, this is not clear enough for us. Can you help us understand the environment a little bit better? Do you have some more? You can push back, and when you do that, you actually open the door a little quicker for us to come in and make that change. Does that make sense? So we kind of need you to help us too, to help police departments and law enforcement and child protective services, if you use that, to say we need more information. We're not getting enough about the trauma to make a good decision. Can you help us out? And that way you're putting some of the responsibility back on a system that should take responsibility and not put it all on you too. So I would say that as part of a social change agent, I would say that. Robin? Okay. Yeah, we're part of a key stakeholder for the Sacramento Regional Family Justice Center. This particular project that we're working is something in 2 years that we intend to have this particular funding expanded so that this can go countywide and it can operate through the Family Justice Center so that it will reach everybody in the county. And we all have a consistent level of training that Robin said, so everybody's on the same page, and our response is similar. So I'm saying you're part of the solution, so help us out and push back a little bit and ask for that clarification. You just take one and we'll share that one. Yeah, you guys ready for
that? Elaine, you said there were 3 cities or counties that are part of the grant. What are the other 2?
Napa and Bakersfield.
Okay, thank you. And also, I know I can just imagine what our joint powers who are on the phone, and we also have victim who are stationed at victim witness centers across the state. So there's a lot of victim witness advocates as well, not on the phone, on YouTube, watching, who are probably thinking, when can they come to our county? Do you guys travel? Is this, because I'm anticipating that question. Don't you guys think?
Here's the one thing about Robin and I and Dave. We will go anywhere at any time and train anybody because we think that we all are part of the solution and that you know how to do your job, but you're lacking some information to know how to do your job better. We know that we can all reduce this frustration, the repeat cycle that we're all in, if we could all get on the same page. So while when we look to expand this thing, training becomes a big piece of it. So if there are folks in other counties and other places, in Napa and in Bakersfield, it's not the same model. We each had the opportunity to create what would work within the partnerships we have. So I can't tell you that Bakersfield or Napa runs it the way we do. We actually had this model of DVERT to actually make it more active already. But this is a law enforcement grant. So this came through DOJ. This did not come through the domestic violence movement. So that in and of itself is phenomenal because it came through law enforcement. So that's already a step towards systems changes. But we are very happy to go anywhere at any time and any place to train anybody about this thing, as you can tell.
I have one more question, and then we can open it up too, or you guys can make your other comments. Dave, do you know if POST requires, the law enforcement training through POST requires that officers get a certain amount of hours of training in domestic violence and or in children exposed to domestic violence?
Yeah, and I don't know exactly what the hours are. I know it's changed over the years. I believe that POST requires officers to be exposed to 12 hours of training in domestic violence, which include advocacy and children exposed to domestic violence. And at the Sacramento Regional Academy, we include training on the implication and intricacies of domestic violence. We like to have advocates present on the cycle of abuse as well as the power and control wheel. And we also do role play with the officers where we'll set up in different rooms mock domestic violence situations, and the officers will have to go in and handle situations based on the role that they see.
You guys ready for questions, or do you?
So just about the environment, I wanted to talk about that for just 2 seconds. What is the kind of healthy environment a child is going to need, right? So we're talking about these little small kids, and the younger you can intervene and create a safe and healthy environment for kids, the better it will be. So the first thing we need to understand is this: when a mom, when she separates, right, and that child is a minor, she still has to be in relationship with the abuser. So she's not free till that kid's 18. That means she still has a lot of level of abuse to still deal with when custody exchange happens every week, right? And that's one of the #1 reasons law enforcement gets called is a 415 that went bad, okay? So we need to understand that. So the abuse isn't over just because she's gone. If you got a minor child, it's not over till that child is 18. That's the first thing. So and when we talk about resilience, is something that resilient children are made, not born. My little story used to be part of the UC Berkeley School of Social Work. How did you get to be who you are now with that resilience? It was teachers. I had great, fabulous teachers. I had other environments that showed me something different, that was calm, that was consistent, that was kind, that actually talked to me in a way that gave me choice. I didn't know there was a choice. I didn't know that you could have that. So in our center, we have a sanctuary model. That model is subdued lighting. There's no fluorescent lighting anywhere. There's music everywhere. There's aromatherapy everywhere. It's kind of like a spa. The cops like hanging out there. They don't realize why they like it over there, but now they're like, oh, we like it over here. CPS loves it over there, right? And so do survivors and children. We just opened the first trauma-informed preschool for children exposed to domestic violence. We have a little tiny center in Carmichael. We designed that to be for kids exposed to DV because they need a certain kind of environment. And if we were to kind of label what would we look at a template, we modeled ours. We took a little piece of the Waldorf model, which is very basic and very natural and very nature-based. Our center does not have a whole bunch of toys everywhere. It's very, very calming. And our kids who come to play care just once a week for 90 minutes, this is what made us go to that preschool idea, we saw such change in them, and we only got them 90 minutes a week. So we decided if we could expand that and have them be exposed to us more frequently, they'd have something to compare and choose, all right? So when you're thinking about kids in therapy, for example, they're in a calm, wonderful environment for 45 minutes, and then they go to war. So when you think about how long do they need therapy like that, as long as they're living in the war, as long as they're living in the war. When they can leave the war, they have a choice about the kind of environment. But as long as they're under 18, they're still living in the war. So how much therapy do they need? Therapy to deal with the war. Does that make sense? So your life, and then the other part is that we don't get back to normal. We just get used to it. And we learn to adapt, and we learn to rise above that. We learn to recreate ourselves. And as I've often said, the woman I am today is not the woman I was intended to be. It's the woman I have chosen to be. And I've created an environment and a community around me that supports that. And then lastly, in all the recent national research that has just recently been done on our coalition level about how do survivors define success. Survivors do not define success as leaving the abuser. They do not define success as how many services and counseling sessions can they go to. No. They define success as a community that understands them, that allows them to grow at their pace, to have knowledge and education about the issue, and for them to have choices and resources to access when they have the capacity to do it. That's how they define success. Sometimes it's, I just need a transitional house. Sometimes I just need to get my utilities from being shut off. Sometimes I just want new locks on my door. Sometimes I need a new address. It's not the same as what we would define as a successful life, and we have to also understand that when we're making referrals out about what's going on. So now it's your turn to ask any one of us any question we have inspired in you or it's not yet been answered. So let's go for it. Yes, ma'am.
Let me use the mic to come to you so everyone can hear it.
The question that she asked regarding how we approve claims, because sometimes if there's not enough information, they can call the detective and ask if, in their opinion, did a crime occur. So what I'm wondering is, based on what you said regarding officers and, you know, was it just verbal, this, that, how much does their background play into, I mean, are we basing it on an opinion of somebody who could be prejudiced by their own experience?
Yeah, good observation. I think that collaboration is hugely important in contemporary society and the workplace. Bill Bratton published a book in 2012 called Collaborate or Perish. And none of us are isolated anymore, and if you have to rely on reports and information prepared by other agencies, then it's important to establish a collaboration with that agency or somebody in that agency that understands what you do and why you're calling for additional information. Now, this is one of the things that Elaine and Robin and I tried to do in our travels, is to help bridge some of these barriers and establish collaborations with other agencies. But it's real important that the person you're talking to understands the implications and intricacies of domestic violence as well as your role. So if you don't feel that's occurring, then I would recommend that you try to find somebody in that department or somebody else in law enforcement that can help you bridge that barrier and establish a more effective a collaborator with that department. But yeah, sometimes we project and we are prejudiced.
That's a great question, because there's a lot of hidden truth in that. And the hidden truth is that if we go back to the myths that we had up on the screen here. A lot of professionals out here in our culture are helping to perpetuate the problem because of a lack of accurate knowledge and understanding about the issue. Mika, you asked the question about POST. So when Dave's given you this approximation of what POST is requiring right now, if we go to master's students in grad school, you know, how much DV are they getting? This is why I am an advocate for uniformity in training. You can go from one DV agency to another, and the comprehensive training is very different. How much they'll go into the history, how much they'll go into the laws. We're all mandated to give the same services. We're all mandated to train the same things, but it doesn't always come across. It's not always comprehended by the audiences. It's not always integrated. So then we go out to all of our other service providers. Law enforcement, firefighters do not understand DV historically. Doctors are just getting up to speed. Of course, again, their focus is mostly on the physical because they're coming into the ERs. But this is part of our cultural challenge, is that everybody has just a piece. That piece is not always accurate, and not everybody is singing from the same sheet of music.
So then lastly, you remember last year we did our first Children Exposed to Domestic Violence conference there in Citrus Heights. We had 350 people participate. We're following that up this year in April on the 29th and the 30th at ACFP for community responders. So people who really need to understand how to work with the rest of us and how we can all respond. You're certainly welcome. There's only 50 people we're only going to do 50 people. It's very small, intimate, but really we're just trying to create very informed community responders. So my suggestion also will be, when Dave talks about collaborating, this is why it's so important to have your domestic violence providers as your experts or as your consultants or someone that you can call. If there are great officers in every police department and at least one that knows something really about DV. There's at least one. So our goal is to find the one. You know what I'm saying? And even it may not be that detective with that report, but and it's also the way you can ask the question. Sometimes folks don't understand what you do. So sometimes you have to say exactly what you said. Our claims are dependent upon this narrative. Based on what you have given me, I don't know what I can do to help this victim. Is there more information I can have that would help me make a decision about just how much help this victim is going to need, or how much help this child is going to need? Is there more information somewhere or someone I can talk to get that information? So sometimes we assume everybody knows our jobs. We don't know what your job is. You know, the first thing we had to do with CPS is, could you tell us what your job is? Because, you know, the only thing we know is you take kids. No, that's not what you do. You see, that's the myth that's out there, but that's what everybody thinks. So we first have to understand. So y'all know your job, but we don't know your job. So you might have to educate us a moment before you ask that question. Okay, does that help? Just a little bit.
Great. Other questions? Brian, are you getting any instant messaging? Oh, anything else in the room? Or comments? Yeah, absolutely.
No, I've worked here a real long time, since about '85, and I've seen a lot of DV presentations, and every time I come to one, I learn some things that I didn't know before. It's a very complex issue, and I appreciate the opportunity to learn more about it.
Thank you so much. We're learning every year, too, and we've been in it. You know, we're learning every year, and it's very exciting to have this collaboration between systems, because everybody's doing their research in their own genre, but now we're starting to share it. And as we share it, we're finding all the pieces that fit. If you just keep remembering, it's a brand new movement. We need everybody. We need you to share. You have to be able to tell us what your difficulties are too. You have to be able to say, what's my barriers and what am I not getting to make my job better? At least at ACFP, we want to know that, because then if training is necessary, then we will. You know, we are a training center, so we really love training. If it's just a small thing that we can just say, maybe you want to ask the question this way, you'll get this. So that's what trauma informed means to us. And so if you can find an agency or you can find an organization that you can do that information sharing with, we're all going to benefit from it. And so I think that's the bigger outreach that we need to do, and that's why it's phenomenal that you're here.
Social media. I've noticed a couple times people have posted things about domestic violence victims on Facebook, and I usually think about it for quite a while before I respond, but I try to let them know not to blame the victim, and there's a lot of reasons why people stay, and I just kind of try to bring up things to make them think about what the comments they've made before they carry on the myths that we all hear. You know, try and make them think about it, and I find that I get people liking my comments. You know, I'm thinking, okay, these people have probably been there. They
Right,
understand what I'm
exactly.
saying. So that's one way to get out.
Yes.
Yeah.
You got to use the social media. You know, I'm old and I really don't know how to do all that, but I do know it's important for us to do it. And the other part of it is that I think all of us can start to ask different questions too. You see, instead of the question of why does she stay, we might ask, why does he hit somebody he loves? We might ask that question. You know, is there a reason why somebody who loves somebody would hit somebody like that or abuse somebody like that? I mean, why would they do that? You see, if we ask that question, then we're putting the responsibility on the behavior, not the victim. And it's hard to do, but we got to just retrain ourselves that there's another half of the problem. Okay, we're seeing the victim, but there's a reason there's a victim, so we should be asking the question about the offender too.
I also like the reframe of what does she need to feel safe?
Exactly. And for us to assume there are blocks and barriers. We must assume there are blocks and barriers. And there's so many of them. We haven't even named them all, you know? You can name all the historical trauma that communities of color have with systems just right off the bat. Right? So I can have a long history of understanding how some communities of color are treated by law enforcement. And if I'm part of that community, I don't know, and what's the likelihood I'm going to call? Not so much. Okay? The other thing you have to understand is that inside of domestic violence, one of the first things an abuser needs to do is make you understand and believe that law enforcement will not respond. So you won't even bother to call.
Other comments? All right, I'll make the final comment then. I just wanted to say I love Bruce Perry. I'm one of his biggest fans for sure. So I know you've heard a lot from Dave about Bruce Perry. Definitely go to YouTube and search his name. You're going to find a lot of videos and a lot of great speaking excerpts, but there's also a 14 or 15-minute video called First Impressions, and it's not copywritten, so it is up there. It is so good. We started showing it in application intake and eligibility determination, which is a 5-day training that we do here because we cover special crimes, and domestic violence is one of our special crimes that we work with. So it's just a really powerful video that kind of sums up a lot of what you've learned today. And one of the last things that he says at the end of the video is, if you want your child to be kind to your child. If you would, on your way out, please leave your evaluation. Make sure you did sign in, and let's give a hand to our guests.
Thank you all so much.